Hello, all, and thank you for joining me on this little talk here. I'd like to talk. This is an area that I research and have been doing work on for, I don't know, 30 years, going on 30 years now. Before even supply chain management was called supply chain management, and the title, as you see here, is Green Supply Chain Management: Making the Business Case. You could also use the same arguments for sustainable supply chain management, and sometimes people use these terms interchangeably. So what I'm doing here on the first page is showing you a little bit of, publicity for some recent books that I had. This one here is a handbook where we have about 33 chapters related to research and emergent issues in sustainable supply chains. This one here is a very short primer to green supply chain management. And some of the stuff that I discuss here is actually in this book as well. And it's a standalone book with 8 chapters related to various issues in green supply chain. And of course, the greening supply chain book that I have from the middle 2006 or so, that's also a research-oriented book. So all I'm going to do today is just talk about a couple of things. First of all, what is GSCM, which is Green Supply Chain Management, and how can organizations make the business case for green supply chain management? Because that's an issue in terms of why would an organization want to do that. So I kind of bring it in and say, look, this is what green supply chain management is, and then essentially say, now why would organizations wish to do this? And that's the presentation. We can have a discussion around those points. So I'm assuming since you are taking operations or supply chain management that you've had a little bit of history here. So I don't have to describe this portion in detail. Sometimes it depends on my audience. Some audience members may never have heard of supply chain or just heard it, in a slightly different context or a general context. But essentially, it's a term that gained popularity in the 1990s. I think the first time the term supply chain management was actually used was in a 1984 article in a Wall Street Journal article. And it didn't gain popularity in the academic literature until a little bit later. And I would say in the mid 1990s to 2000s when it really started taking off. But before that, what you had is operations management, purchasing, logistics, and marketing in their own fields and disciplines, essentially kind of teaching the same thing. Although marketing did it with a distribution perspective, operations and purchasing, focusing on internal and downstream perspectives, were all part of the whole supply chain or supply linkage of materials and products and information flowing through the system. So what you have here are 4 major managerial disciplines joining together to form supply chain management. Now, one of the people that was a big proponent or the big, catalyst for supply chain management was Michael Porter. If you've heard of Porter's value chain, is a strategist, a strategic thinker. And he said, look, when you bring all these together, you essentially form a value chain. And the term chain then got picked up as supply chain and so on. And it's not just supply, but it's also distribution. We'll show that a little bit later as well. And this is Porter's value chain. And in Porter's value chain, essentially what you have are the core or primary activities of inbound logistics operations, outbound marketing, and service. Inbound logistics and procurement kind of go together in some ways. So again, these are the 4 disciplines. He said you could bring these all together and really they form the core of what an organization really has to do. And of course, he also has other items supporting things like the firm infrastructure, which includes technology, information systems, and human resource management, supporting capacities and resources. This is a standard type of value chain perspective. Now, when you start looking at it, you see a lot more sub-activities. Essentially, the whole organization in different ways contributes with a series of activities, processes, and functions that work together to at least deliver a product or a service in the end to a core customer. So notice here the complexities that are arising. Not only is it now just one function, operations, but it's procurement, logistics, marketing that comes into play, and sales, and all the separate activities and sub-activities that go with them. So supply chain management is a complex topic, and you've come across that in your classes already. And there's no way around it because you need to integrate all these activities together to essentially provide service to a customer. So this is one definition, and this is from 1999 when the term really started to take off. I would say around 1999, turn of the millennium, is when supply chain management, and this was the definition, and probably very closely to the same definition that's being used today. Now, the problem here is this is a very linear definition, and linear systems are easy to understand. They flow from here to there. Now, green supply chain and sustainable supply chain start to change a little bit. When you start talking about closed loop systems, reverse logistics, bringing materials back, not just a forward flow and then disposing after use, but actually keeping materials within the development or value chain system. That was essentially missing in a lot of what the early supply chain literature was trying to get at. Now, another dimension, and during this time, not only has supply chain been evolving, but the idea of corporate environmental management has been evolving. It used to be that corporate environmental management focused on, well, just meeting the law, complying with the law, making sure you don't get penalties, you don't get fines, and so on. But it evolved. During the same time that supply chain management was evolving around the 1990s and early 2000s, corporate environmental management started to become more of a strategic issue, a way for organizations to gain competitive advantage, to build partnerships, to actually provide new ways of providing products and services. And there's different tools and techniques, and these are some of the things that it evolved from. You have meeting environmental laws and regulations, the first thing you should do in corporate environmental management. That's essentially the baseline that most corporate environmental management organizations try to do. And then you become more proactive, such as, well, let's develop environmental management systems that can help us improve and actually make money in the long run. Let's do a life cycle analysis, not only the product within the organization, but across the organization and up and down the supply chain as well, over the life of a product. You have design for the environment. So when we design it, we design products with the environment in mind, not only for usability, manufacturability, and all these other design for X type things from an economic and business perspective, but also from an environmental and maybe even a social perspective to improve products, processes, and materials. There's liabilities and safety, expanding it to the safety and environmental health aspect of things. There's waste management, managing the system from a broader perspective. And we'll see a little bit more of that in the supply chain, how it links in, and carbon footprints and ecological footprints in general, not only carbon, but land footprints, ecological water footprints have also been developed for corporations to use in the design of their processes and systems. So that's corporate environmental management systems. Now, what does green supply chain management try to do? It brings corporate environmental management with supply chain management, essentially recognizing that supply chain and industrial processes definitely and have a clear impact on the natural environment and ecological resources. So this is why it's become a more critical issue, because sustainability has become or greening and environmental issues have become not only a source of competitive advantage, but requirements for you to do a lot of these other activities that we're going to discuss later. So bringing it together, what is green supply chain? And again, these are very early definitions, and even now the definitions have expanded to include social concerns and social issues as well. But if you notice here, there's multiple definitions even of green supply chain management. And in academics, what we need to do to provide clarity, to be able to do research to advance the topic, we need to really have a clear definition of what it is. In my case, I have it as a broader definition. I don't take it as downstream, where you're dealing with just suppliers, or just upstream or marketing with products and so on, but the whole supply chain. And this is where I bring in this model here. And what you see here is my model of what the supply chain really is. And in there, you can see different activities that are related to greening and environmental issues at different functions within the organization. So I kind of took a little bit of what Porter's value chain looks like, a little bit of what the more standard supply chain literature has defined it, and brought it together, and operations and logistics as well, and brought it together in this one model just to show you the breadth of topics that can exist in managing the environmental issues facing a supply chain. The first ones, of course, you see this listing here. These are areas where I have researched and published as well as developed cases and so on. But what you need to look at first is that there's upstream upstream considerations of managing vendors and suppliers. And there's a number of issues here. One that I view as being most important is in the middle here, which is essentially supplier development, helping suppliers and your sub-suppliers become more environmentally sound, conscious, and maybe even socially sound as well. So you have these upstream activities in all these areas, from performance and benchmarking and developing how to measure green supply chain management in the upstream. Also, if you notice here, in every aspect of the supply chain, you have energy flows. Energy is needed to make the supply chain go, whether it's service supply chain or whether it is a product or material supply chain. But energy is a prerequisite. As a matter of fact, arguably, the value of your product is very much correlated to the amount of energy put into the product. And there's even a big theory around that as well. So energy-related research is critical within a green supply chain, and energy management is also critical. And you could go about it from a number of different ways. And one of the techniques that I've used is greenhouse gas trading, because energy also is an emitter of greenhouse gases, and energy costs money. So somehow conserving it also helps the organization in different ways. Now, in production, this is the actual operations. If you look at operations management, you talk about environmental management systems like ISO 14 or ISO 9000 for quality issues, for design, or not design, but substitutability policies, performance measurement, and measuring the costs of your operations. In this case, using environmental tool or environmental dimensions in evaluating the cost, the true cost of your operations is another issue. Moving down, we have outbound logistics, which is delivery, transportation. We also had it with inbound logistics as well. And then waste needs to be managed. The first thing, of course, there's a waste hierarchy here, and this is part of the green supply chain, is that you don't generate any waste at all. Reduction is the first and best principle you can have. So reducing the use of resources and energy is one of the first things you should try to do. But if you can't, then try to manage it in different ways. And we'll see that, that later on, that managing it by bringing it back into the system is part of what they call the circular economy principles. Reverse logistics is needed for this. And there's all kinds of issues related to reverse logistics. I have them here as research topics. For example, how do you go about setting up or designing a reverse logistics channel? A lot of what we have been doing over the years is designing the forward supply chain and really optimizing that to the best way possible. Reverse logistics seem to have gained a little more interest because now they realize that you can extend the life of a product, and designing that in an optimal way can make organizations money as well as doing well for the environment. And we'll see some of that later on as well. Of course, the design and marketing process, another aspect of the value chain, is critical here, and you have to deal with green consumers, process selection, and designing products such that they're both attractive and environmentally sound. So those are some of the ideas and principles, and each one of those topics that we talked about is a paper or a book in itself, and that has expanded over the years. Oh, so the question is, given all of this, you have a lot more to do. You don't have to do it as an organization. Some of it you have to do, like reporting and managing it. But notice I didn't mention a lot about the reporting and management of it. I'm saying you should help your suppliers become greener. You should, change your systems and invest in environmental management systems. You should develop a reverse logistics network. You should manage energy in a different way with considering the carbon emissions. You don't have to do this as an organization. and it adds a lot of complexity. As you saw in that model, there was a very complex set of processes. Now, supply chain and supply chain managers and operations managers, the first thing they try to do is get the product out the door. Why are you making me do all this extra stuff that I don't necessarily have to do just to make sure the customer gets their product? That is my ultimate goal. Make money and sell out the product. So the question of why not do it is very clear. It could be expensive. It could cut into your margins. It can be very complex. And complexity does not, it takes away from doing your job because you have to manage all these other things. It's messy related to that issue as well. It's like, oh dear, I have to deal with this and I have to make sure this regulation, and this customer wants it to be green from this perspective. Another reason why organizations wouldn't want to do it is, well, we don't know how to do it. We don't have the expertise to do all these things. Why should we invest in more expertise? And it just takes away, again, from our core responsibilities. Some of them say, well, hey, there's no reason for us to do it. We're an oil company. Come on. Why do we need a green supply chain? Why do we even care about that? There are no guaranteed solutions. Even when you try some of these things, your materials, your products, your processes may still not be green. And finally, we just don't have time. I have too many fires to fight. We've kind of alluded to all of that there. So why not do it? Well, there's a lot of reasons why organizations should not do it. And I can give you a dozen more reasons why not to do it. But let's go on from that and just say, why do it? And this is where it comes in. This is where the business case comes in, and why the theme that I'm presenting is a necessary consideration, that when you are making this decision, consider the broader picture. Not only is it good for the environment and good for people and where you live, that's a given if you decide to make things greener. But there's also benefits to the organization, strategic and competitive benefits. Number one, that everybody likes to use is that you have economic benefits from being more efficient. When you generate waste, you're essentially having money go up your chimney, out your pipe, or taken to the landfill. Any wasted material that you had paid for. And you might even be paying for it to get rid of as well. So you want to minimize the amount of waste, and to do that, you can be more environmentally sound as well as being more efficient. So this is probably the number one reason why organizations like to green their supply chains. It's called eco-efficiency. You want the efficiency of your system such that it does not generate waste and is better for the environment overall, or it reduces waste or reduces the use of materials. And there's a number of examples here. General Motors saved money, $12 million by using reusable containers. These solutions do not have to be too complex. Just simply saying, let's go to plastic. Well, plastic's not a good thing, but let's just say reusable containers in some way that you don't have to throw out the materials when you can bring them back and reuse them again. You can save it by effective resource management. You know, these, by the way, these examples, 12 million and $25 million, these were from the late 1990s still. And you could even see these being a magnitude larger these days, depending on how large your organization. And servicizing, which is an interesting proposal here. This is one of the ideas behind actually changing the business model between supplier and buyer. And this is an example here of DuPont and Ford. Now, as we all know, Ford makes automobiles. And what do they use when they make automobiles? More appealing is paint. And where do they get the paint from? Well, one from the biggest chemical manufacturers in the world, DuPont. So what they decided, Ford decided that, you know, we want to make it more efficient. And I think there's a way of making things more efficient, but why don't we ask our suppliers to determine how to make it more efficient? In this case, DuPont, and DuPont sells paint to Ford, of course. DuPont wants to make money, and the best way of making money is to sell as much paint as you can. And that was the agreement, that we pay you by the gallon. Now imagine if the contract had changed between Ford and DuPont. No longer is it how many gallons we can sell to Ford, but how many cars Ford wants to pay us for to paint. And that was the slight difference that went from selling gallons to selling how many cars to paint, which essentially went from a product of paint to a service of painting cars. Now, when they changed it from that perspective, what would DuPont want to do? Now they don't want to sell as much paint. As a matter of fact, they want to sell as little paint as possible and paint as many cars as possible. That way they can get a much larger margin for every car painted. So that helps them start thinking, gee, how can we paint more cars with less paint? So it's a resource reduction issue. It becomes a resource reduction issue and cost reduction issue rather than a revenue generation and putting out as much material, we don't care where it goes type of issue. So that kind of changes the mindset a lot in terms of the relationship you have between supplier and buyer. There's a number of servicizing examples. This is just one example of servicizing. Reason number 2, and I have 5 total reasons. We saw reason number 1, reduce cost. Reason number 2 is for revenue generation. And essentially it is, instead of paying people to take waste from you, why not find an alternative use for your waste and generate more revenue? And this is almost like the idea of industrial symbiosis. An industrial symbiosis essentially is one organization's waste is another organization's flow product, product that you can purchase, usable material. So in this situation, what they said is we can develop a system where we both can make money off of this. We could sell it as incoming material at a cheaper rate than other material, and we don't have to sell it or get a disposal company to take the waste away from us, and we have to pay them for it. So it's a double win there in both of cost reduction and additional revenue generation. Now, in the circular economy and industrial symbiosis, they call this byproducts management. So you develop byproducts that used to be waste, but now are saleable items. Another one here is taking these items that used to be for something else and changing them over to a new product or material that you could generate new revenues for. So that is one aspect of revenue generation. Another aspect is you can actually make more money sometimes by making green products and processes and selling them as a premium. So there's more revenue generations by being green in different ways. The third type of business case dimension that you could look at is the license or the right to operate. Some areas of the world have certain regulations that may not be regulations in where the home country of the company would be. For example, if you do business in the United States, you don't necessarily have to follow European regulations unless you do business there. Now, globally, all the big companies want to do business globally because that's where markets are. They're global. But you have to be aware of the law. And there's one example here is the restriction on hazardous substances law, which was enacted in European Union, South Korea, China, and so on in 2006 and beyond, 2006, 10, 12, 13. Now, to do businesses in those countries, you could only sell products that have certain materials that are not in them. And in this case here, there's a law, there's a saying that there's 6 toxic materials that are not allowed to be sold in products in Europe or in any of these countries. So you have to make sure that this product or material does not appear anywhere in your supply chain while you're making it and ending up in the product. And there's a very famous example here of the Sony PlayStations, where they were trying to, in the Sony PlayStations, they were ready to make these big sales of Sony PlayStations in Europe, and it was around Christmas time. And this is when most PlayStations are being sold. So Sony didn't realize that their supply chain had a few problems because the product was working perfectly. So they shipped, $300 million worth of Sony PlayStations to Europe. But when they looked at the bill of materials at the customs border, I think it was in Rotterdam, they said, look, you have 2 or 3 items here, materials that are in your PlayStation where you cannot sell in Europe. Because of these violations, we cannot let your $300 million worth of Sony PlayStations be sold. And that is because somewhere in their supply chain, they used one of these restricted materials. So make sure from this perspective that certain aspects of greenness, like hazardous materials, are not in your supply chain. Otherwise, you may not have a license to operate. A major business issue. And there's more examples for each of these, by the way. Number 4 is supply chain resilience. And we've heard a lot about resilience within the COVID crisis. How resilient is the supply chain, and how do you build resiliency? Now, having a green supply chain can build resiliency. And this is one of the arguments and issues, relationships that we've been investigating. Does sustainability or greening of a supply chain increase supply chain resilience? So far, we found more examples that are yes rather than no. And in this case here, the most famous example is the seafood example. And Walmart facing its sustainable seafood program. Now, one of the things that we do know is that you can overfish. And if you overfish, you're not practicing sustainable fishing. You're essentially causing biodiversity to decrease. You're killing off ecosystems and a lot of other environmental issues. Now, if you know that you practice sustainable fisheries, marine stewardship type of certifications, that fish are allowed to survive and you don't overfish, which is an environmentally sound green practice in the supply chain. By practicing this, you guarantee the resource will be continuous, that there would be business continuity and you will have fish. But it has to be practiced. And of course, there's limitations on that. If you do try to green your seafood supply chain or your agricultural supply chain, you could improve the likelihood of a continuity of resources, building your supply chain resilience. That's the basic theory and some of the ideas for building that aspect of the business case. And finally, image and reputation. Now, how do you put a value on image and reputation? You do have accounting principles such as goodwill. And you have accounting principles that are very intangible in the sense of, well, our reputation has improved and people will come to our store, won't feel guilty about shopping at our store or buying our product or material because we have a morally sound and environmentally sound supply chain. And this is one of the ideas here. Walmart, and this goes back to Walmart facing some big issues. Walmart does not have the best reputation everywhere in the country because of social issues or concerns, underpaying workers, not giving them health benefits, discrimination, a number of things that Walmart had been facing for decades. And Walmart is a big target, so they have to be on top of their game. So what can they do? Well, they can improve their reputation by focusing on some of these green practices that actually contribute to their bottom line by either generating revenue, reducing costs, or allowing them to do business in other areas. And in this case here, it also improved their reputation. And they saw how important the improvement of reputation was when they became the best logistics provider in terms of an emergency logistics situation for Hurricane Katrina in Louisiana. It was at this time where they realized, look how much goodwill and image improvement we had from doing something good. So the CEO essentially said, we're going to do a sustainability program. We're going to do green supply chain, greatly improving the image and reputation of Walmart, not completely eliminating it. I mean, there's still people who say, we're not so sure how green they are, but they've been making an effort. And by Walmart making this effort, just to say that we want to try to be green, it has essentially changed half the world almost to become greener because Walmart asked them to. Whether it's in China, whether it's these small manufacturers, their whole supply chain started focusing on becoming greener. And that is why it can be a very powerful thing that these intangible factors, image, reputation, can be very powerful in changing green supply chains. So in conclusion, greening will continue to be an issue and is still an issue today. It's even more of an issue now in the sense that why should we be green? We have to get our supply chains working to solve this pandemic. So now one of the questions that I have going to the future is COVID going to be good for sustainable green supply chains, or is it going to be bad? In some ways, it's going to be good because companies can realize that they could change things very quickly given a crisis, whether the crisis is a pandemic or an environmental crisis like climate change. There's much complexity and diversity that needs to be achieved in supply chain, green supply chain management. There is no one solution to everything, and the one solution may have trade-offs that we may not be aware of. So sometimes trade-offs need to be made and will be made as you make some of these decisions. The best situation is when there's win-win situations. That is, you can improve economically and environmentally. But they don't always exist. Sometimes there's a paradox, and sometimes you have to consider, are we considering the full value, the benefits, and the costs when we make this decision? The possibilities are extensive. You saw that list that I showed you, and that's only scratching the surface of things that I've investigated. There's probably double or triple or many times that list where there's issues there that could be greening, that could be business, that could be general, specific, broad-based, or to a material or product or an industry. Overall, I think we need to integrate this thought process. And I think a lot of companies and executives realize that this thought process is important from a variety of reasons, whether it's global reasons or local reasons, whether it's consumer or competitive reasons or regulatory reasons. And I think that's about it. So that's what I want to present, just a little across the surface issues facing green supply chain and making the business case. And now I will entertain any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much for the presentation today.